Hi friends, welcome back or welcome if you're new here. My name is Stacy and I am the Chapter Conundrum. And in today's video, I want to do my November wrap up. So we're going to talk about all the books I managed to read last month and how I felt about them. So I managed to read 7 books, which isn't great, but also isn't terrible. The unfortunate part is that I kind of threw my goals for the end of the year out the window. I hit a slump. But then my mood reading gremlin emerged and I started reading some holiday romance. But I also did find a new favorite last month. So we got a lot to talk about. Let's go ahead and get into it. So the first 2 books I picked up and read were All the Lies and Paint It All Red, which are book 4 and 5 in the Mindfuck series by St. Abbey. And I'm going to talk about them together. I gave them both a 3.75 star rating, so not quite as high as the earlier entries in the series, but I still considerably enjoyed them. So this series follows a romance blossoming between a female serial killer and the FBI agent that happens to be investigating the murders that she's committing. But she's not just a random serial killer, she is out for revenge on some people who did really terrible things to her in the past. And a lot of this book series is kind of like trying to piece together and figure out what the heck happened in order for her to do these things and why is she doing the things she's doing. So I'm happy to say that books 4 and 5 definitely answered those questions for me. The third act conflict for the romance introduced, of course, was a doozy as predicted, but the fallout was pretty good. In terms of the answers that we got that I was talking about, like that were the catalyst for the revenge, I felt like for how built up everything was, it just felt kind of rushed through. And I also was kind of frustrated that we didn't really get that information from the main character's perspective. I think it was probably intentional on the author's part because I feel like if you had have taken your time and you had have gotten it through the main character's perspective, there would have been a lot more emotion and probably like she didn't want to do as much detail and go as dark and kind of have the narration ruminate on those things as much maybe. But I think it would have been a lot more impactful had we had that and had we taken our time and just kind of like leaned a little bit more into that. Overall, these 2 books in the series were kind of predictable for me based on everything that was kind of layered into the earlier ones. And they also focused a lot more on action and kind of like wrapping things up in the storyline rather than the character emotion. And yeah, so like it was fine. It was enjoyable. I still found a lot to like, but I think to have these be standout reads, I needed more of that character emotion and just more focus on the things that we had been built up to. And I just would have loved to see more of like how the main character was feeling in those action moments instead of just figuring out what happened. I did really like the epilogue of book 5. But yeah, I would say overall a solid series. I'm glad I finished it out. It's definitely very addictive and easy to binge. I would recommend it. I still liked it, but I definitely enjoyed the earlier books in the series a bit more. Next up, if you saw my last vlog where I challenged myself to read a certain amount of pages, I think it was 400 in 24 hours, you'll know I ended up finding a new favorite, Blood Over Brighthaven by Emma Wong. So this was absolutely 5 stars. In here, you follow 2 perspectives. The first is Tomil, and he is a refugee in the city of Turin. And the second is Siona, who is going out to be the first female high mage in this society. So in the beginning of this, you open with Tomil's experience arriving at Turin, the struggle involved in doing so, and then you jump into Siona and you start to learn a little bit more about the city, how it's shaped, how it functions, a little bit more about the magic in this world. And eventually our 2 perspectives come together and the story is pretty interesting from there. So I really love how ML Wong structured this one. I thought she definitely did a better job of giving us all the information we needed to know up front in the beginning sections of this, but it didn't feel so info dumpy like it kind of did in Sword of Kaigen. This did kind of have a similar pacing to where like the beginning chunk was kind of slower and then like you got kind of a oh crap moment and things kind of pick up and go from there a lot faster. Emma Wong is definitely fantastic at writing deep character moments. And some of the standout moments in here were kind of like when the characters are going through the darkest of dark things, sort of the moments that they have or the realizations that they have. Some of the quotes in here that were like in the darkest of dark times for these characters were pretty deep and gave me chills. And that's not an experience I have reading very often. I think I've only ever had one other book give me chills, and it was The Burning God by R.F. Kuang. But definitely ML Wong managed to do it for me in here. So I also really loved the social commentary in here. This was kind of like everything I wanted Babel by R.F. Kuang to be, in that we got a lot of the commentary sort of through the characters' realizations and things that were said to them, things that they were feeling. It felt like subtly ingrained and woven into the story, even though it was pretty obvious, like commentary for the most part. Instead of like hitting the reader over the head with like overtly stating things, it's definitely a lot of things that you kind of infer from reading this, and it's not necessarily stuff that's told to the reader. I definitely found this satisfying but heartbreaking at the same time, and that's kind of how I describe my experience with Sword of Kagan too. Like I knew ML Wong would rip my heart out and stomp on it, but in the best way, and kind of like get me emotionally invested in what I was reading, and she definitely did here too. I can confidently say that she knows how to write an amazing hard-hitting book at this point, and yeah, definitely recommend this one if you haven't read it yet already. Next up, I picked up and read Never Saw Me Coming by Vera Kurian. And this follows 7 psychopaths all attending the same university in DC. They're all involved in a study at the university, but they don't really necessarily know each other until one of them turns up murdered and another one is trying to figure out what happened. So I was definitely intrigued by the premise of this one, and I enjoyed some of the character moments, especially in the first half of this. We got some kind of exploration into how these psychopaths were masking in their day-to-day lives in order to quote unquote fit in. It was interesting to explore some of the things that they maybe struggled with as characters, some of the ways they felt different, some of the ways they stood out, how they were coping, and kind of like living their day-to-day lives and just reacting to things around them. That was probably one of the standout elements of this book for me. And I also really enjoyed a lot of the character backstory and side plot elements here. It was a little bit frustrating because I felt like every single side plot or background thing introduced was more interesting than the main plot that we were dealing with here. And I think it was just the way that this was written, to be honest, because it felt like even the characters were more invested in their own backstories or their own tangents. Like it felt like the characters were less invested in the main plot as well. And I think it's just the way that the narration kind of unfolded, perhaps. I also kind of felt like this book just lacked in focus in that regard. Like we didn't flesh out the main plot enough for me to get invested and care. So overall, I liked this, but I didn't love it, and I ended up giving it a 3-star rating and calling it a chill. Next up, I picked up and read Holy Disruptor, Shattering the Shiny Facade by Getting Louder with the Truth by Amy Duggar. And if you don't immediately recognize that name, Amy Duggar is known as Crazy Cousin Amy on the TLC show 19 Kids and Counting, or I think the title changed when they had more kids. I don't know. But anyway, she's the cousin of the main Duggar kids on the TV show, and she's touted as Crazy Cousin Amy. So this is her memoir, and this was interesting to read about. I was kind of unsure of what to expect going into this. I mean, I knew that we were going to have some content about like how she experienced her cousin's like rigid family rules, kind of the IBLP or the Institute of Basic Life Principles that their family was kind of indoctrinated in. She obviously grew up a little bit differently, so it was interesting to kind of hear her commentary on like how their upbringing was different and also kind of how she was viewed by her cousins and sort of that type of thing. So I wound up giving this a 4-star rating, and I really enjoyed that she narrated the audiobook. There were definitely times in here where you could hear the emotion in her voice, and it was interesting to see how she emphasized certain points in the book. I definitely felt like the experience of reading this was richer for having listened to her read it. And also think kudos to her for doing that, because there's a lot of tough subject matter in here that I'm sure was difficult for her to like relive writing and then relive again narrating. So yeah, I was kind of surprised that she made the decision to narrate it, but I'm glad that she did, and I definitely think it's a worthwhile experience. So I also want to kind of touch on how this book is structured. So chapter 1 kind of reads a little bit more like a sermon, and it kind of had me very concerned going in. I was like, oh no, is this going to be the whole book? She talks a little bit about some of the teachings of IBLP and sort of like how they contradict scripture. And I think it's important context for the story you're about to hear. But then on the other hand, like if you're already familiar with this family and sort of the IBLP rules in general, it just kind of felt like a bit of a rehash. And it also feels a little bit impersonal until you get into the next couple chapters that delve into her story more. So her story was definitely interesting, and I definitely learned a lot more about her specifically. There were definitely things in her upbringing that I didn't expect or didn't know, and it was interesting to kind of hear more of like the general family history from like her grandfather. And then in the second half of the book, she goes more into kind of her experiences with her cousins and the TV show, which is mainly what I was expecting from this book more so. But I also don't necessarily feel like she had a lot to add to the conversation in that segment or that section of the book. Having read one of the older sister Jill's books, so like Amy's cousin, who is like one of the oldest sisters in the TV show, she kind of outlines in her book Counting the Cost a lot of what Amy brings up in her book as well. So there was nothing really necessarily surprising in that section. But it was more interesting to read from Amy's perspective in terms of like how she was viewed by her cousins having a different upbringing and just kind of like her feelings on everything that went down. I definitely thought that this was a worthwhile read, but I think I enjoyed Jill's book Counting the Cost a little bit more. And then I jumped into Out of the Woods by Hannah Bonham Young. So this is the second book in the Out series, the first one being Out on a Limb, which is a favorite of the year for me. So this one I liked, but I didn't quite like as much as Out on a Limb. This one I gave 4 stars to, and it follows the best friends from book 1. So this follows Caleb and Sarah, and they are a couple who were kind of like high school sweethearts, got together and married pretty young. They've definitely been through some crazy life stuff together, and at the start of this one, they're kind of having a misunderstanding that has made them drift apart. And they try and reinvigorate their relationship by going on like a hiking retreat for couples kind of thing. So this is the story of how that goes. So I definitely liked that we got some multiple timeline snippets in here. I enjoyed seeing more of the characters' backstories because I always feel like when you're reading a romance between an already established couple, it can be a little bit tricky to kind of buy into their relationship because you don't see it being established and you don't necessarily understand like why they're together or why they choose each other. So I definitely thought that the past timeline snippets in here did a good job of showcasing those elements. You can definitely see that they are compatible as characters, and it made the present timeline story more enjoyable for having those elements fleshed out. I also enjoyed the present timeline of the retreat, some of the side characters on the retreat, and sort of like how everyone kind of reacted to this couple was interesting. Despite all of those elements, though, I did kind of struggle a little bit because having a couple that was like together for, I don't know, like 15 years at this point, it's kind of strange that they really only have like one issue to address in this book, or like that one misunderstanding that was like part of one issue. Like, I would have thought that these two would have had more stuff to tackle or work out, having had been together so long. And it also just kind of felt strange that they like were sort of like devolved to a certain point to only both do like a 180 and kind of like come together with a better attitude right away. It seemed like that should have been more of like a nuanced progression. And so I can definitely tell like Hannah Bonham Young tends to write more of like wish fulfillment, like happy stories. And I felt that way with Out on a Limb too. Like the story didn't necessarily feel realistic, but it did feel like a fun wish fulfillment. I think the difference and why I enjoyed that one much more was that there was a lot more humor and just a lot more really good character banter in that one. So while I enjoyed this one and I liked it, it definitely didn't hold up to my enjoyment of book 1. And then the last book we have to talk about today is The Holiday Honeymoon Switch by Julia McKay. And this one wasn't really on my radar until I found out that it was a buddy read for the Bridge for Books Discord. So I'm kind of like newer to their Discord. I found out about it from Amanda of her Reading and Writing Life because they do some interesting year-long challenges, and they had just announced some challenges. And they also do reading sprints over there that are text-based, which is kind of fun. But anyhow, I decided that I was going to pick this up from the library and join in on their December buddy read, except my hold for the audio came in early, and I needed an audio for the car on Thanksgiving when Jake and I were driving to and from family, and this just happened to pop up at the right time, so I decided to start it early. So in this one, you follow two best friends, Holly and Ivy, and Holly is set to get married, and Ivy is her maid of honor. But the night before the wedding, Holly's husband, Matt, calls the wedding off. And they had this really crazy honeymoon booked that was paid for, I think, by one of their parents. But Holly decides that it would be kind of weird and depressing for her to go on the honeymoon, but she doesn't want it to go to waste. So she wants her best friend Ivy to take the honeymoon and enjoy it, because Ivy is an artist and she always goes on this like art retreat kind of type vacation where she goes away for a couple weeks by herself to just draw and enjoy the landscape and the scenery. And Ivy had a previous kind of like cabin in upstate New York booked for her art holiday. So what they end up doing is switching holidays. So Ivy goes to Hawaii on the honeymoon type trip for her art, and then Holly goes to a cabin upstate in New York. And then this book follows kind of some blooming and blossoming romances with men that they meet on their vacations. So I definitely thought that this was not a realistic story with the way it unfolded, but it was a fun story and it definitely had some interesting holiday vibes. It was definitely interesting to see how the characters in these different places looked at and celebrated Christmas, how their attitudes differed, and kind of like the traditions they had. I did find this one cheesy, but not cheesy to the point of like Hallmark movie cheesy. Like cheese factor, I would say this is like a 3.5 out of 5. And then a spice rating, I would say this is like a 1.5 out of 5. It's like there's some things mentioned, but it's more like inferred, and like there's not a whole lot of scenes. My main kind of gripe with this one, other than it being unrealistic, was just that the foreshadowing was pretty heavy handed. Like the author would throw in something that she would specifically mention, and then you're like, oh, that's going to come up later. And you know kind of how it's going to come up. And then you see it come up and you watch it unfold, and that's kind of how like the story keeps playing out. And then she'll mention something else, and then that thing will come into play. But yeah, so I thought the foreshadowing was kind of heavy handed and it was very predictable. There wasn't really any surprise in the story for me. But I also don't think that when you're reading a holiday romance, you necessarily want surprise or unpredictability. Like you want more of like that comfort, cozy type reading experience. And I thought that it did that well. I will also point out, I didn't know this going in, but this is written by a Canadian author, which was fun. So there was a couple like cultural references that I definitely picked up on. Like she mentions Mr. Noodles specifically, which is like our version of ramen. And then there's also one part in the audiobook where it's very obvious that this is a Canadian author, but an American narrator, because one of the characters in New York is described as coming up on this scene wearing a toque. And you're just like, what the? Oh, she means toque. And she just doesn't understand like that's how we pronounce it. So that is our name for a beanie, and it's a French Canadian word, which is kind of like why it's not necessarily pronounced how you think it would be pronounced. But yeah, so there were some moments in there where I enjoyed seeing the snippets of Canadian culture come out. But also it was a little bit frustrating that it was narrated by an American who didn't understand. So that was all the books I read in the month of November. Definitely let me know down below in the comments, what was your favorite read of last month? As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out if you want to, and have a great day. Bye.